Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. As all of you know, tomorrow there is going to be the presentation of the union budget or the central government budget. So before that presentation, today let's have a look at certain very important announcements that we might expect, which might be done in the budget tomorrow. But before looking at these announcements, or let's say before looking at some of the expected announcements, here is a very important pointer. Hundreds of announcements are done by the government annually in the union budget. For UPSC examination or for that matter any competitive exams, you don't have to study all the announcements done by the government. There will be certain very important announcements. Let's say, for example, a scheme has been announced by the government, or certain reforms have been announced by the government under the taxation system. Reforms in order to promote ease of doing business. Reforms have been announced, let's say, in the context of promotion of exports tomorrow. Or let's say, in order to boost the recovery in the economy, certain counter-cyclical policies announced by the government. So these are the important types of announcements, or let's say the measures announced by the government that you're supposed to have a look, study, understand and remember for the competitive exams. So today, let's have a look at certain important areas that we might expect to be covered in tomorrow's budget. But before that, tomorrow at the same time 8 p.m. we are going to have a live session discussing the announcements, again keeping in mind the requirement of the competitive examination from the budget that have been done. So before I enter into the important announcements that I expect the government to do, and again please understand this, I'm not a member who was involved in the preparation of the budget, and you must be knowing about it already. Whenever certain important personnel or let's say certain bureaucrats who are involved in the preparation of the budget, they are kept in isolation right now so that the announcements are not made public. So I was not involved in the preparation of the budget. That should be very clear to you by now. So two very important events have taken place in the last 1 week. The first photo that you're looking at right now is basically the photo of Halva Ceremony. The Halva Ceremony earlier had very high importance. In a sense, Halva Ceremony earlier means what? 3 years before or before 3 years, used to indicate the start of printing of the budget documents. Means the government has decided that, okay, this will be the number of announcements that we are going to make in the budget. Everything is finalized. Now, this ceremony will indicate that government has started printing the budget documents. But I'm pretty sure all of you know this by now. For the last couple of years, Government of India has done away with the practice of printing physical budgetary documents. That is, they don't print the budget anymore. It is basically everything in a digital format now. That practice has started for financial year 21, 22, 22, 23, and even this year it will be again a paperless budget or simply a digital budget. So this is one event, and second event which you must be very happy with, I'll come to the reason again, is today itself the Government of India has announced the economic survey or has come out with the economic survey document. Now some of you will basically say, sir, if the government has come out with a document, why should I be very happy with that document? For a very simple reason. Until a couple of years ago, specifically until last year, whenever the economic survey was announced by the government, there used to be 2 volumes of the economic survey. The first volume generally consisted of around 10 chapters, basically covering a lot of very conceptual areas. And second volume would simply consist of a lot of factual data for the last 1 year, at least for the last 1 year, for the Indian economy. For last year as well as this year, Government of India has not published 2 volumes, it has published only 1 volume. And some of you would have already downloaded the document to have a look at the document. It is somewhere around 440 pages, and if you have scrolled it, first 40 pages is basically acknowledgement, index, acronyms, etc. Now, should you read the complete economic survey? Not necessary. It's not required. For a very simple reason, the government has published only the factual data for the last 1 year, which is generally not required, but certain concepts which are discussed, certain, let's say, reasons which are cited by the government, let's say for reduction in the exports, for expansion in the current account deficit, these are generally the areas that UPSC might pick up and ask a question in prelims as well as mains. Now, regarding the economic survey, you don't have to be worried. We will have a separate session on the economic survey. So, today's agenda for you people is simply have a look at the important areas where you can expect an announcement tomorrow. And the areas that I would be covering is one, we will start with the discussion about the investments, or in simple, capital expenditure. Second, we will have a discussion about agriculture as well as subsidies. And in addition to agriculture and subsidies, the third area that I'll be covering will be industries, certain important areas where announcements can be done tomorrow. After that, we'll have a look at taxation, right? What can be the announcements within the taxation area? Then there is the disinvestment policy. Guaranteed there will be certain announcement regarding disinvestment. How much will be the question? Then certain important areas within the stock market, and finally the fiscal deficit, debt, as well as the growth parameters. Now, let's have a look at it. First one, investments. Now, all of you know that to promote growth in the economy, you need to spend a lot of money. The logic is very simple. If the government or the private sector spends money, the production increases. But along with the production, the demand for raw materials increases. The employment is generated, which will basically kickstart, again remember this, kickstart the growth cycle, which is basically called as a virtuous cycle in the economy. Now, what has been the situation in case of Indian economy? For the last 2 years, especially for financial year 20, financial year 21 and financial year 22, we have seen that the pandemic has affected the amount of investment specifically coming from the private sector. But when the private sector investment is lower like this, it is the duty of the government of India to ensure that there is a higher expenditure that is done in the economy in order to boost the growth, in order to promote recovery. And since I'm talking about recovery here, today's economic survey, the chief economic advisor specifically in the speech stated that the recovery is done for the Indian economy. There is no need to discuss any kind of a recovery for the economy now. What is the meaning of it? Simple. After the pandemic, or let's say because of the pandemic, the GDP took a hit. That's a fact. And right, slowly and steadily, there has been a growth again in the GDP. So as per the CEA, right, already the recovery has happened. You don't have to talk about the recovery anymore. But if you look at beyond this, what has the government of India done? Just have a look at the graph here. You will generally see that government of India has incurred a huge amount of capital expenditure, especially in the last couple of years. Just have a look at the orange graph here. You will realize that government of India has incurred a lot of expenditure. Now, should you remember these numbers, not specifically, I'll give you one more data. Please remember that. Government of India for the current financial year, when the budget was announced, government for the current financial year stated that they would want to spend somewhere around 7.5 trillion rupees under the capital expenditure. Capital expenditure, in short, capex. Right now, what is the importance of it? Like I already have stated, there has been an impact of pandemic. Private sector doesn't invest too much during the slowdown or the recession in the economy, and at that point of time, the government, you will see that, has increased its capital expenditure. Now, many of you look at this graph and also tell me that, sir, you are talking about capital expenditure, but what about revenue expenditure? If you see, the revenue expenditure as a percentage of GDP also has increased. And we read in our classes, even in the NCERT, saying that government should always incur capital expenditure. It creates assets. But in the graph that I have shown, it is actually the revenue expenditure which has increased by a large margin compared to capital expenditure. There is a reason for it. What is the reason? Simple. It's correct when you say that it's a fact that government needs to spend a lot of money in creating assets compared to consumption. That is revenue expenditure. But one of the reasons why there is a rise, again I'm talking about technicalities here, one of the reasons why there is a sudden rise in the revenue expenditure as a percentage of GDP compared to pre-pandemic era is because Government of India started phasing out the concept of off-budget liabilities. That is, those liabilities which were borrowings of the government beyond the budgetary process, government has started repaying them, including them under the revenue expenditure. And that is the precise reason you will see that the revenue expenditure is higher compared to capital expenditure. Done. So this is one. Second, government, please understand this. Yes, it's a fact that pandemic is there, but is the government sitting quiet? Is it not promoting private sector expenditure? That will be an understatement and it will be factually incorrect. The reason why you can say that government is taking measures in order to promote expenditure or let's say investment from the private sector is very simple. Look at what has happened to the overall investment, let's say under a scheme such as PLI, Production Linked Incentive Scheme. Initially we started with covering only 3 sectors, but now we have covered 14 sectors. And in fact, there is a point regarding PLI in the subsequent slides. We are expecting that government will be taking or including couple of more sectors under the PLI now. And when PLI is introduced in a particular sector, you will get incentives, but there are conditions attached. What kind of conditions? Investment conditions. So it's not that only government is spending and private sector is sitting quiet. Absolutely no. Even the private sector investment has actually increased. But again, please understand this, compared to government, private sector investment has stagnated. I'll just quote the recent data here. For the second quarter, there has been a decline in the investment from the private sector. So you'll have to wait and see what Government of India will actually do tomorrow in order to promote more and more participation, investment from the private sector. Now, apart from this, how much has been the capital expenditure boost here? You can have a look at it. The budgeted estimate as well as the revised estimates, right? If you have a look at it, you will realize that Government of India initially has budgeted certain amount, but when the budget has been implemented, that is in the next financial year, when the implementation has taken place, the overall capital expenditure has been much higher. And like I've said, government this year has announced that we will be spending 7.5 lakh crore rupees or 7.5 trillion rupees in the capex. Right? Government also has announced 1 lakh crore rupees 50-year interest-free loans for the state governments as well to promote investment. And as per the latest data, by the end of November, out of this 7.5 trillion or 7.5 lakh crore rupees, more than 60%, okay, more than 60% of the investment already has been done. Now, that is one related to capex or investment. Second, what are the important areas that we must expect tomorrow under the agriculture and subsidies? First, very important announcement that most of the experts have stated that government might do or most likely is to do is increase the allocation under PM Kisan. Under PM Kisan, right now the allocation that has been provided is 6,000 rupees per year. 6,000 rupees per annum or per year. It is expected that government will increase this by 2,000 rupees and take it up to 8,000 rupees. And as a result of this, of course, no doubt, the overall expenditure of Government of India is going to increase. But what is the reason? Argument is simple here. In recent times, there has been a concern over unemployment, concern over demand in the rural market. One of the ways to increase the demand in the rural market is provide the people with more money. Simple. Give or ensure that people will have more money so that they will use this money to consume goods and services in the market. As a result of this, the demand for goods and services will be increasing. And that is very important. Why? In the month of January 2023, the first advance estimate was given for the Indian economy. That is for the current financial year. what could be the possible growth for the current financial year, advance estimate has been provided. And if you dissect the data, you will realize that whenever you talk about expenditure, right, because GDP can be calculated through three measures or three different methods. If you look at the expenditure method, around 60% of the GDP comes because of the consumption demand itself. So there is a need to ensure that there's a consumption demand in the market. So government might do this. Right. Second, the rural demand has to be boosted. One of the reasons I've already told you, or one of the ways I've already told you. Any other measure that the government can take to boost the rural demand? Increase the allocation under Manrega. Simple. Increase the allocation under Manrega. Or third way, rather than focusing only on the rural market, right, how to cover the overall India? Change income tax rates. Right. In fact, I want to quote the recent statement that was given by Finance Minister, who stated that the Finance Minister, that is specifically Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman, she stated that she comes from the middle class and she understands what burden is there on the middle class because of certain issues in the economy. So you might expect certain changes even in the income tax rates so that people will have more money and that will automatically increase the consumption demand in the market. Third one, food and fertilizer subsidy. This is nothing new. Food subsidy and fertilizer subsidy are basically the very, very important or a very large amount of expenditures which are incurred by the government. In fact, very recently regarding food subsidy, Government of India has introduced a reform. What is the reform? Pradhana Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana has been discontinued and it has been basically brought or subsumed under the concept of NFSA, National Food Security Act. And under the public distribution scheme, food grains, 5 kgs of food grains will be given free of a cost. Again, that has been announced for a certain limited period of time. But because of that, Government of India is expected to save a lot of money. Now you need to have a look at the data tomorrow. As a result of this, how much will be the change in the food subsidy for the current financial year and how much money would be allocated by the government in the next one financial year. Fertilizer subsidy, very, very important. Why? As per the latest data given by the government, the fertilizer subsidy has already overshot. For the current financial year, Government of India had allocated somewhere around 1.05 lakh crore worth of fertilizer subsidy. But because of Russia-Ukraine war, because of rise in the natural gas prices in the market, because of the rise in the imports, depreciation of the rupee, etc., the fertilizer subsidy bill has already overshot. As per various estimates, it is expected to be more than 2 lakh crore rupees. Now you'll have to wait and see, will government do anything in order to reduce the fertilizer subsidy for the next financial year? Because please understand this, all these, you take food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, right, etc., all these are part of revenue expenditures. And government has to keep the revenue expenditures under check so that the revenue deficit will come down and finally it will help us in reducing the fiscal deficit and meeting the targets that we have set up under FRBM. Next, in industrial sector, as already mentioned, PLI, production linked incentives. PLI, production linked incentives. There are various sectors which already have stated that, or the leaders of the sectors have stated that they would want the PLI to be extended to the respective sectors so that more and more sectors can be brought. Production can be promoted, exports can also be promoted. It will promote employment generation, self-reliance, etc. Now there are 14 sectors already covered, but various experts have already mentioned and even various government sources also have mentioned that Government of India is considering extending PLI to cover many more sectors. And please understand this. It is possible with the same amount of allocation, that is 1.97 lakh crore rupees, which has been allocated under PLI. It is possible to cover more sectors because under PLI there is a facility to basically use the funds which are unutilized for a particular sector if they require it to be used in other sector. That is, in simple terms, I have allocated 10,000 crore rupees to sector X, but I have utilized only, let's say, 2,000 crore rupees. So unutilized is 8,000 crore. I can use it, right, to provide the incentives in other sectors. That facility is there under the PLI scheme. So you might see Government of India extending the PLI to cover more and more sectors. Next, renewable energy. Definitely yes. Right, I'll give a very simple example. Very recently, Reserve Bank of India has launched sovereign green bonds. SGB, sovereign green bonds, which have been successful in terms of, let's say, getting placed in the market. There was a good demand for the SGB. And this is not the only initiative of the Government of India to promote, let's say, sustainable development in the Indian economy. There has been promotion of wind energy production, promotion of solar energy production, right, etc. And in continuation of this discussion, if I want to add couple of more, Government of India has been promoting even electric vehicles. FAME 1 has been implemented. FAME 2 is under implementation, etc. And even under the Income Tax Act, certain amount of interest that you pay when you purchase an electric vehicle, you can claim it as a deduction while filing income taxes. So in the context of sustainable growth or sustainable development, you might expect announcements done by the government, right, for wind energy projects, solar energy projects, or electric vehicles as well. It could cover one sector or more than one sector. That is, you will have to wait and see tomorrow. And in fact, any initiative that the Government of India takes now to promote the renewable energy or, let's say, sustainable growth will ultimately help Government of India to meet the zero emission challenge by 2070. Right? I'm pretty sure all of you know this. By 2070, Government of India says we want to become net zero emission economy. So any reform, and I expect certain reforms or measures to be announced by the government in moving towards this goal of net zero emission. Next one, SEZ, Special Economic Zone. Right? Now please understand this. The government in the last year budget itself announced that we will make certain changes in the special economic zones. We will restructure because there were issues with the functioning of SEZ. There was a committee recommendation also to make changes in the SEZ policy. Government last year announced it. Then they introduced the Desh Bill, Development of Enterprises and Services Hub. That bill has been there in the discussion because there are certain issues where the ministries are not on the same level. That is, they are not in agreement. Ministry of Commerce says something else. Ministry of the Finance, that is under that Department of Revenue, right, differs in their opinion. As a result of this, there has been a lot of discussion regarding the Desh Bill. Now it is expected that the government might reintroduce with certain changes this Desh Bill in the upcoming budget. Again, it's a long shot. Very few of the experts have stated we might expect government to reintroduce Desh Bill, or let's say introduce Desh Bill during the budgetary session. Whether that will be referred to, whether that will be taken up by the government or the finance minister in the budget, you will have to wait and see only tomorrow at 11 a.m. Next, under the taxation, right, a lot of areas to be covered under taxation. Let me pick up the most favorite ones or most important ones. First one is capital gains tax. Right, originally the concept of capital gains tax was implemented where the holding period was uniform for all the assets, 3 years. But over a period of time, more and more assets have been brought in. The holding period has been changed. In some assets, it's still 3 years. That is basically to differentiate between long term and short term. In some assets, it is 12 months. In some assets, it is 24 months, etc. So as a result of this, there is no parity of holding period for all the assets, right? For all the assets in the capital gains taxation. And as a result of this, there is, right, certain confusion. There is arbitration of the assets, right? Arbitration is being used by the investors to hold the assets and sell them off in the market, etc. And citing this, Akhilesh Ranjan committee already has recommended making a uniform holding period, restructuring the capital gains tax. Now, right, most of the experts have stated we might see a uniform structure that the government of India is proposing under capital gains tax tomorrow. Having said so, please understand this. There is also another thought which says no, government should not introduce the changes of capital gains in the budget. Why? The concept of capital gains is very complicated and it requires a lot of consultations of stakeholders, and maybe government can take it up as a separate, not in a budgetary form, separated, right, reform, and hold consultations with all the stakeholders, institutions, then maybe introduce certain changes in the capital gains tax. Regarding income taxes, personal income tax, again, I've already told you one way to boost the demand, not only in rural market but also in urban market, is provide more and more tax exemptions. And within this personal income taxes, that is individual income taxes, right now there are two structures under which there are, under one of the structure there are 3 slabs, and in the other one there are around 7 slabs. And government in the second one, right, that is the latest structure of income taxation which was introduced couple of years ago, government of India stated that very few of the taxpayers have opted for it. Now government of India is thinking of making certain changes, certain amendments to the new taxation, income taxation structure, so that more and more individuals such as you and me will start adopting it. Whether it will be done or not, you'll see tomorrow. Corporate taxes, even in the corporate taxes, there are 3 very important numbers. One is 15%. Those which will start manufacturing in the next 1 financial year, they will get the benefit of 15% corporate taxes. Another one is optional 22% without any exemption. And another one is, as usual, the older number 30% with exemptions. Government in 2019 introduced the 22% corporate tax rate without any exemptions, of course, and expected that we will have lot of these corporates opting for it. As usual, very few of the companies have opted for it. Now, will government add any sweetener? Will government provide any exemption to this 22% so that the adoption increases? You will have to wait and see. Next, tax amnesty scheme. Nothing new regarding tax amnesty scheme. Government earlier also has announced various tax amnesty schemes. For example, there was a scheme by the name of Vivad Se Vishwas scheme. Even before that, there was one more scheme by the name of Income Disclosure Scheme, etc. Right, so basically, new types of schemes, tax amnesty schemes have been announced by the government. And the reason why I focused on tax amnesty scheme here is very simple. In the recent times, as per one survey, more than 6 lakh crore rupees worth of tax revenues have got stuck up in the dispute, right, because of various issues between the tax authorities as well as the taxpayers. Right, now the government of India wants to address these tax disputes so that the locked amount or the amount of tax revenues which are stuck up basically will be realized by the government. Right, so that is the precise reason, okay, that is the precise reason we are expecting a tax amnesty scheme to be announced tomorrow. Next, wealth and inheritance tax. Not very popular, but I am going on a limb here. Government might simply surprise the market by announcing one of these taxes, wealth and inheritance taxes. Wealth taxes is not new. Earlier was there in the Indian economy. Government has withdrawn it. And why I am focused on the wealth and inheritance tax? Again, please understand, most of the experts, right, do not believe that government will bring any of these wealth and any of these two taxes, wealth and inheritance tax. They don't expect government to bring it. First and foremost, inheritance tax is never there in India. Wealth tax was there, but withdrawn by the government. Now, why there is a discussion about wealth and inheritance tax? Reason is very simple. I'm pretty sure all of you heard of Oxfam report, which was published recently. In the Oxfam report, the authority stated, or the institution which published the report stated that top 1% of the population in India controls somewhere just over 40% of the wealth. Top 10% of the population in India controls 72% of the wealth. India houses one of the highest number of billionaires, which has actually increased in the last 2 years, etc. So this might simply provide a window for the government of India to say that yes, there is a huge, right, basically disparity of income as well as wealth, and citing that government might, basically it's a surprise, right? I don't expect the government to do this, but let's say, right, government might surprise all of us. Government might introduce one of these, that is a wealth and inheritance tax. Next, fiscal deficit. First and foremost, FRBM, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. FRBM Act has not been amended by the government for the last 2 to 3 years. Government has not amended the FRBM Act. But government has clearly stated that by financial year 25-26, we want to reduce the fiscal deficit to somewhere around 4.5 to 4.6%. Under FRBM, the actual target is 3% fiscal deficit. We are yet to reach 3%. For the current financial year, the fiscal deficit that is targeted is 6.4%. And please understand, fiscal deficit basically means what? Borrowings are done by the government. I'm pretty sure all of you will agree with me when I say fiscal deficit is nothing but borrowings by the government. So the government of India in the last 2 years has actually borrowed a huge amount of money. And the reason is right in front of you. It is because of the pandemic. And in the year when the pandemic affected the Indian economy most, the borrowings of government of India were very, very high. Even for the current financial year, government of India has budgeted somewhere around 14.9 trillion rupees. Let's round it up, around 15 trillion rupees. Again, will it be exactly 15 trillion? Neither do you know, nor do I know, because the financial year is yet to end. But the budgeted estimate is somewhere around $15 trillion, which is higher than, right, last year. And the economy or most of the market expects that in the coming days, in order to promote investment as well as recovery, or let's say higher growth rather than recovery, higher growth in the economy, basically government is expected to borrow more than 15 trillion rupees, right? The proposal is expected to be more than 15 trillion rupees, right? So this is related to fiscal deficit. Now, apart from fiscal deficit, there is also one more idea of debt. Borrowing here basically is about debt. Right, now please understand this. Borrowing is, right, this much proposed for this year. But please understand this, the overall debt of the central government plus state government, right, overall borrowings of the central government or the debt of the center plus state government, it is more than 90% of GDP, and that is a cause of concern. I hope you understand this. It is more than 90% of GDP, and the central government's debt alone is more than 60% of GDP. And as per FRBM review committee, encasing review committee, we are supposed to drag it down to 40% of GDP. Exact number is around 38.7% of GDP. And the state's overall debt is also very, very high. Right? So the concern is very simple here. Government, in order to promote growth, will borrow more money. Right? Yes, that's agreeable. But on the other hand, when the government borrows such a huge amount of money from the market, what do you think will happen to the overall debt of the government or debt of the central government plus state government? That will balloon. And when the debt of the central plus state balloons like this, next point is, what do you think will happen to interest payments? Because if you look at the budgetary documents or budget documents of the last couple of years, you will find one very important expenditure that is done by the government. The interest liabilities or interest payments that are done by the government in a budget is more than 20% of overall expenditure. That's very, very high. I hope you understand my statement. Because government borrows heavily, right? Because the government of India has borrowed heavily, the amount of interest that the government has to pay automatically balloons. And please understand this. Various authorities, international organizations, nevertheless state that this is a vicious cycle. This is a very, very important vicious cycle that economies are falling into. Why? In order to overcome the issue of pandemic, promote growth, promote recovery, government will borrow heavily. As a result of this, interest to borrowings will balloon. And in order to repay the debt, generally you will see that government borrows more again. I hope you understand this. In order to repay the debt, government again borrows more. And when the government borrowing increases again, it simply means the debt of the center plus state is again ballooning, which is contributing to again the same cycle to be repeated. Right, so basically, right, the borrowings are expected to be higher, but there is a concern over the debt as well when the borrowings go beyond the control like this. Right, so these are some of the important areas that we are expecting the announcements to be done tomorrow. But again, having said so, are these the only areas? Of course no. Of course no. There are so many other areas where the government can again make announcement. For example, infrastructure. Government in the last 1 year itself, has announced logistics policy. Government has announced a lot of investment in the infrastructure. Government has been promoting PPP, etc. Another example of renewable energy infrastructure. Government has very recently announced National Green Hydrogen Mission. In fact, there is a talk that the exports of green hydrogen will be covered under RODTEP. Right, so again, please understand this. Right, there are other important areas as well. And we can talk about these areas throughout the night and wake up morning 11 o'clock directly and have a look at the budget or announcements are done directly by the government. Another area of announcements that I expect the government would do is basically in order to promote exports. Because in the last couple of months, especially in the last couple of months, the exports have been affected. And there is a logical reason for it. Inflation rates in the Western markets is higher. Inflation rate in India is higher. And I expect certain important announcement that the government will do in order to protect or let's say provide certain solace, certain comfort for the middle class people in order to protect them from the rate of inflation or high rate of inflation. Right, so current account deficit has been widening. Imports are very, very high. Right, if you look at the first advance estimates, the imports out of the GDP, imports are very, very high, more than 25% of the GDP. Exports are less than 22%, which means we are importing a lot. Dollar outflow is very, very high. So current account deficit has widened. The forex reserves are depleting, etc. So government might also, in order to protect the domestic market, right, reduce the imports, might also announce higher customs duties on certain finished goods as well as, let's say, certain items which are imported into India. Right, so there are other important areas as well. There are very other important areas where certain announcements will be done by the government, on which we will have a detailed discussion tomorrow at 8 p.m. And finally, before I wind up the session, right, what about the growth then? What about the growth? If you look at the newspaper, OECD has pegged the global growth at somewhere around 2.2% for the year 23, 2.2%. United Nations says global growth will not be 2.2%, it will rather be around 1.9%. And the budget, right, the economic survey which was published today, for the next financial year, the estimated growth will be in the range of 6% to 6.8%. And for the current financial year, it will be somewhere around 7%. And even the first advanced estimates for the current financial year have also stated that it will be somewhere in the range of around 6.5 to 7%. Again, you don't have to buy at exact numbers because these are simply estimates. I hope you understand my point here. These are simply estimates, not the final outcomes, not the actuals. So you don't have to buy hard. But what is important here? Government definitely will focus on the growth. Because some of you are basically pointing out, sir, talk about elections. Definitely yes. There is a dichotomy that you could observe tomorrow in the budget. Dichotomy in the sense, certain important announcements which are populist in nature. And please understand, let me not enter into the political aspect of it, but there is a reason why they are going to announce it. The reason is, there are many states which are going to go to elections this year. And there is Lok Sabha elections next year. So there could be certain populist measures which are which would be announced or which could be announced. Let me basically underline the term which could be announced tomorrow. But on the other hand, government might simply say, forget about populism, we'll stick to the idea of fiscal consolidation and we'll simply follow the path that we have already established for the last couple of years in improving the quality of infrastructure, in promoting investments, in controlling revenue deficit, fiscal deficit and overall debt of the government of India. Right, so these are the important areas of discussion that I wanted to have regarding the budgetary expectations that you could basically focus on tomorrow's announcement at 11 a.m. Right, so that's it from my side. Before I wind up the session, again an important reminder. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. we will have a detailed discussion about the budget that would be announced by the central government, or let's say the finance minister, tomorrow. See you again tomorrow at 8 p.m. Thank you. Take care.